Sometimes the most forgotten among us carry the deepest secrets. Sometimes the loneliest souls hold the greatest honor. For 20 winters, the villagers of Holmvik whispered about Bjorn the Quiet. The old warrior lived alone in the dark forest, speaking to no one. On this snowy morning, he walked to the village gate wearing only a simple wool cloak. But he was not alone. 14 wolves surrounded him. The village guards grabbed their spears, expecting an attack. But the wolves just stood there calm and waiting. Then Bjorn raised his hand. The largest wolf stepped forward and bowed its head to him. How could a poor, forgotten old man command such respect from wild beasts? The answer would change everything. The village thought they knew about honor, loyalty, and the bonds that connect all living things. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Holmvik, nestled in a valley where the mountains met the sea, its wooden halls and stone hearths weathered by countless seasons. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin ribbons against the grey winter sky, and the sound of hammers rang from the blacksmith's forge. Children played in the snow between houses, while their mothers worked at looms, weaving stories into cloth as surely as their ancestors had woven tales into memory. At the center of the village stood the great hall, its carved pillars telling stories of heroes and battles long past. The hearthstone bore ancient runes that few could read anymore, save for Olaf the Skald, whose weathered fingers traced the symbols like old friends. The stone remembered everything, every feast, every funeral, every moment when the village had gathered to celebrate or mourn. This morning, that hearthstone would witness something unprecedented. Sven and Magnus stood guard at the village gate, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. They had served this duty for 15 years, watching traders come and go, welcoming travelers, and turning away the occasional bandit. Nothing had prepared them for the sight of an old man walking calmly through the snow with a pack of wolves at his side. "By Thor's hammer," Sven whispered, his hand trembling as he gripped his spear. "Magnus, are you seeing this?" Magnus rubbed his eyes, certain they were playing tricks on him. The wolves moved like liquid shadow across the white landscape, their silver-grey coats blending with the falling snow. At their center walked a figure that both men recognized but had not seen in 20 winters. Bjorn the Quiet, the hermit of the deep forest. The man children used in their scary stories and mothers mentioned in hushed warnings. But this was no scary story. This was something else entirely. The largest wolf, a magnificent creature with amber eyes and a coat like winter itself, carried itself with the dignity of a king. The others flanked Bjorn in perfect formation, not stalking or hunting, but walking as companions walk. Their breathing created a soft fog in the cold air, and their paws made no sound on the snow. "Should we sound the horn?" Magnus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "An attack." Sven studied the approaching group. "Look at them, Magnus. They're not attacking anything." Indeed, the wolves showed none of the signs of aggression both men had been trained to recognize. Their ears stood alert but not flattened. Their tails carried low but not tucked, their mouths relaxed rather than snarling. Most remarkably, they seemed to be waiting for something. Bjorn raised one weathered hand, and the entire pack stopped as one. The gesture was subtle, requiring no words or harsh commands. The wolves simply understood. "Good morning, Sven, Magnus." Bjorn's voice carried the roughness of years spent in solitude. But underneath lay something both men remembered from their youth, the unmistakable tone of command that had once made him legendary. "Bjorn?" Sven could barely form the word. "What are you? How did you?" "I've come to speak with your chieftain." Bjorn's eyes, still sharp despite his years, met each guard's gaze in turn. "These are my companions." "They mean no harm to anyone in this village." Magnus found his voice first. "Your companions? These are wild beasts, Bjorn. Wolves kill sheep." "Children, these wolves have killed nothing but rabbits and deer. And only when hunger demanded it." Bjorn's hand rested gently on the head of the great wolf beside him. They are no more wild than any creature that chooses its own path. Behind them, the village was beginning to stir. Word spread quickly in Holmvik, as it did in all small communities, and soon faces appeared at windows and doorways. Some retreated immediately at the sight of the wolves. Others lingered, curiosity overcoming fear. Among those who stayed was Olaf the Skald, his bent frame leaning heavily on his walking staff as he made his way toward the gate. His ancient eyes, clouded with age but sharp with memory, took in the scene with growing wonder. Bjorn Eriksson, Olaf said softly, using a name that had not been spoken aloud in 2 decades. Bjorn the Wolf Friend. The title sent a ripple through the gathering crowd. Even the youngest children knew that name from the old stories, though most had assumed it was merely legend. Bjorn the Wolf Friend, who could track any quarry through any terrain. Bjorn the Wolf Friend, who had never lost a battle. Bjorn the Wolf Friend, who had vanished at the height of his fame, leaving behind only questions and whispered speculation. Just Bjorn now. "Old friend," the warrior replied, but something in his posture shifted. For a moment, the bent shoulders straightened. The careful shuffle became a soldier's stride, and 20 years seemed to fall away like snow from a pine branch. "The stories never did you justice," Olaf continued, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "They told of your skill with sword and spear, your wisdom in battle, your mercy toward the defeated. But they never told why you chose the forest over the feast hall." Young Hakon pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his sword hilt. At 25, he was the village's finest warrior and the chieftain's nephew, trained since childhood to protect Holmvik from any threat. The sight of wolves within speaking distance of the village walls set every instinct ablaze. "Enough talk," Hakon declared, his voice ringing with youthful authority. "Whatever these creatures want, they can find it elsewhere. We don't bargain with beasts." The largest wolf turned its amber gaze toward the young warrior, and Hakon felt his blood chill. There was intelligence in those eyes, not the cunning of a predator, but something deeper, something that seemed to weigh and measure him. "Peace, Ulf," Bjorn murmured, and the wolf's attention returned to its human companion. "Hakon speaks from a desire to protect his people. There's no dishonor in that. You know my name." Hakon's surprise was evident. "I knew your father." "You have his eyes and his courage." Bjorn studied the young man with approval, but perhaps not yet his wisdom. Chieftain Erik arrived then, his heavy cloak billowing behind him as he strode through the crowd. At 53, he commanded respect through both strength and judgment, having led Holmvik through prosperity and hardship alike. The sight that greeted him would have challenged any leader's composure. "Bjorn," Erik said simply, acknowledging both the man and the extraordinary circumstance of his arrival. "It has been many years, too many perhaps." Bjorn inclined his head respectfully. "I come seeking an audience, Erik. There are things that should be said, truths that should be known." Erik's eyes moved from Bjorn to the wolves and back again. The creatures remained perfectly still, showing neither aggression nor submission, simply waiting with the patience of stones. "And your companions?" "Will wait where I ask them to wait, harm none that offer no harm, and leave when I leave." Bjorn's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You have my word," the crowd murmured at this. Bjorn's word had once been worth its weight in gold, but 20 years of absence had dulled many memories. Still, the old-timers remembered, and their whispers carried weight. "The children," Erik said carefully. "They've never seen Ulf." Bjorn spoke the name quietly, and the great wolf moved forward until it sat directly in front of the chieftain. Then, to the amazement of everyone present, it bowed its head in unmistakable respect. A child's laugh broke the tension. Little Astrid, barely 5 years old, had slipped away from her mother's protective grasp and now stood at the edge of the crowd, clapping her hands in delight. "Pretty dogs," she exclaimed, taking a step toward the pack. Her mother, Sigrid, lunged forward in panic, but Bjorn raised his hand. "Let her come," he said gently. "Ulf has children of his own. He knows how precious they are." The great wolf lowered itself to the ground, making itself smaller and less threatening as the little girl approached. When she reached out to touch his fur, he remained perfectly still. allowing her tiny fingers to explore the thick winter coat. "Soft," Astrid announced to the crowd, her fearless joy infectious. "He's beautiful," Sigrid admitted, her voice shaking with relief and wonder as she carefully retrieved her daughter. "But how is this possible?" Olaf stepped forward, his staff tapping against the frozen ground. "Because some bonds transcend the boundaries we think divide us. Because some souls speak a language older than words." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of one who had spent a lifetime preserving truth. 20 winters ago, Bjorn Eriksson was the greatest warrior in 3 kingdoms. His name was spoken with reverence from the fjords of the north to the trading ports of the south. He led raids that brought prosperity to our village and glory to our people. But more than that, he was a man who understood that true strength serves others, not itself. The crowd listened intently. This was their history, told by one who had witnessed it. "The night he vanished," Olaf continued, "was the night he chose a different kind of honor. The night he chose to save lives rather than take them." Bjorn's weathered face showed discomfort at the praise. "That's enough, old friend." "No, it isn't." Olaf's voice grew stronger. "They need to understand. They need to know that the man who stands before them with wolves at his side is the same man who once stood over them with sword and shield, protecting everything they hold dear." Erik studied Bjorn carefully, seeing past the simple woolen cloak and weathered features to the warrior beneath. The bearing was still there, subtle but unmistakable. The eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him legendary. And something else, a piece that had not been there 20 years ago. The Great Hall, Erik decided. "We'll speak there with the village council. Your companions may rest in the courtyard if you can guarantee their behavior." "They'll harm no one," Bjorn repeated. And the certainty in his voice was absolute. As the crowd began to disperse, children and adults alike stealing glances at the magnificent wolves, Olaf remained behind. He approached Bjorn slowly, his ancient hands reaching out to clasp his old friend's shoulders. "Welcome home, wolf friend." Bjorn looked around at the village he had once called home, at the faces both familiar and new, at the place where he had once been honored above all others. Then his gaze returned to the patient wolves, waiting exactly where he had asked them to wait. "Home," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Yes, perhaps it is." The hearthstone in the great hall had witnessed many councils, but none quite like this. As Bjorn followed Erik toward the massive wooden doors, the ancient runes seemed to glow in the firelight, ready to record yet another chapter in the endless story of human hearts and the choices that define them. The great hall filled slowly as word spread through the village. Council members took their places on carved benches, while curious villagers gathered near the walls. The fire crackled in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on the ancient timbers overhead. Bjorn stood before the assembly, his 14 companions visible through the open doors, resting peacefully in the courtyard snow. Erik raised his hand for silence. "Bjorn Eriksson has requested to speak. You all know his name from the old stories. Some of you remember the man himself." The chieftain's gaze swept the room. "He comes to us with an unusual escort, seeking to share truths that have remained hidden for 20 winters." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many faces showed skepticism, others curiosity, and a few displayed the deeper recognition of those who had known Bjorn in his prime. "Speak then," Erik continued. "Tell us why you disappeared from our midst and why you return now with wolves as your companions." Bjorn looked down at his hands, scarred, weathered, but steady. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held memories. 20 winters ago, I returned from what would be my final raid. We had struck deep into enemy territory, claiming victory and considerable treasure. The men spoke of my growing legend as we rode home through the mountain passes. They called me blessed by the gods, touched by fate itself. He paused, his eyes finding Olaf among the listeners. The old skald nodded encouragingly, but on that journey home, the very forest itself seemed to burn around us. A great fire, started by lightning during a fierce storm, had consumed leagues of woodland. The air was thick with smoke and ash. My men wanted to ride around it to reach home and safety quickly. Bjorn's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where beneath his simple cloak lay a small leather pouch, his most treasured possession. I heard them first, the cries of young creatures trapped by the flames. My warriors thought me mad when I dismounted and told them to continue without me. They could not understand why their leader would risk his life for forest animals when glory and gold awaited at home. Young Hakon leaned forward, caught despite himself in the tale. "What did you find?" "A mother wolf and her den of pups, surrounded by fire with no escape. The mother was injured, burned trying to reach her young through a wall of flame. The pups were barely old enough to see, helpless as human babies." Bjorn reached into his cloak and withdrew a small object, a charred leather collar, burned black but carefully preserved. The artifact spoke of loss and memory, of a moment when everything changed. This belonged to the smallest pup. The mother had torn it from the neck of a dead hunting dog, perhaps trying to mark her children with something of the human world. When I found them, she was dying, but she fought still to reach her babies. The hall had grown completely silent. Even the crackling fire seemed muted as everyone strained to hear. I could have left them there. My duty was to my men, to my village, to the treasure we carried. But I looked into that mother's eyes and saw something I had never noticed in all my years of battle. I saw the same desperate love that any human parent feels for their children. Bjorn's voice grew stronger, more certain. So I chose. I chose to enter the fire and carry out each pup one by one. I chose to stay with that dying mother until her last breath, promising her that her children would live. I chose to give up everything I had been to become what they needed. But the raid, someone called from the crowd. The treasure reached the village safely. My men were capable warriors who needed no wet nurse to see them home. But I remained in the forest, tending to 6 orphaned wolf pups who would die without care. Sigrid, still holding little Astrid, spoke up. "You raised them yourself?" "I learned wolves are not so different from human children. They need warmth, food, protection, and most of all, they need to know they are not alone in this world." Bjorn's eyes softened with memory. "They grew strong and wise under my care. When they were old enough to hunt, they chose to stay near me rather than seeking their own pack. But why disappear from the village?" Eric asked. "You could have returned," explained. "Could I?" Bjorn's question held no accusation, only weary understanding. "Think carefully, Eric. What would you have done if your greatest warrior had told you he abandoned a successful raid to rescue wild animals? What would the people have said if I had brought wolves into the village streets 20 years ago?" The silence stretched long enough for everyone to consider the truth of his words. "They would have called you mad," Olaf said quietly. "Or cursed. Or both. The world had no place for a warrior who chose mercy over glory, animals over treasure. So I made a new life in the deep forest, learning its ways, protecting its creatures. The wolves I saved grew to adulthood and found mates. Their children learned to trust me as their parents did. Over the years, our pack grew, not just in numbers but in understanding." Hakon shook his head. "But you were our greatest champion. The stories say you never lost a battle, and I never did lose a battle. I simply realized that the greatest victory was not in taking life, but in preserving it." Bjorn looked directly at the young warrior. "True strength is not measured by how many foes you can defeat, but by how many lives you can protect." An elderly woman named Ragnhild spoke from the back of the hall. "My husband fought alongside you in the southern campaigns. He said you saved his life twice, once from enemies and once from his own reckless courage. Your husband was a good man who fought for the right reasons, to protect his family and his home. There is great honor in such fighting." Bjorn's voice warmed with respect. "But there comes a time in every warrior's life when he must choose what kind of man he wishes to be remembered as. And you chose to be remembered as the man who vanished," Eric said, though his tone held no judgment. "I chose to be forgotten by history if necessary, so that innocent lives might be remembered by their own children." Bjorn gestured toward the courtyard where the wolves waited. Every wolf in that pack is descended from the pups I saved that night. They remember the choice I made, even if the human world forgot." Little Astrid tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "The nice man saved the puppy dogs?" Sigrid smiled despite the gravity of the moment. "Yes, dear one. He saved them all. That's good," Astrid declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Puppy dogs need saving too." The simple wisdom of the child's words seemed to settle over the hall, like peace itself. Olaf rose slowly, his staff tapping against the floor. "In all my years of telling stories, I have learned that the greatest tales are not of conquest and treasure, but of the moments when ordinary souls choose to do extraordinary good. Today we have learned that our greatest legend was not built on the battles he won, but on the compassion he showed to those who could not fight for themselves." Bjorn tucked the charred collar back into his cloak, close to his heart. "I came today because the forest whispers of strangers in the southern valleys, men who speak of raiding and burning. My wolves know danger when they smell it, and they smell it now on the wind." The mood in the hall shifted, becoming more alert and focused. "What kind of men?" Eric asked sharply. "The kind who would see this village as easy prey. The kind who know nothing of mercy or honor." Bjorn's eyes met the chieftain's. "My pack and I offer our protection. If you will have it, you would fight for us again." Hakon's voice held wonder. "After 20 years of exile? This village raised me, fed me, taught me what honor meant before I lost sight of it. The wolves I protect are not the only ones who deserve loyalty." Bjorn straightened, and for a moment the legendary warrior blazed through his humble disguise. "I never stopped being Holmvik's son. I simply learned there are many ways to serve one's family." The great hearthstone seemed to pulse with warmth as the fire reflected off its ancient runes, as if the stone itself approved of the truth finally being spoken within these walls. The council session ended with more questions than answers. As the villagers filed out of the great hall, their conversations buzzed with uncertainty and debate. Some spoke in hushed, reverent tones about Bjorn's sacrifice and the nobility of his choice. Others whispered darker concerns about wolves so close to their homes and children. Hakon lingered near the entrance, his hand unconsciously gripping the iron spear tip that hung from his belt, a weapon forged by his grandfather and passed down through 3 generations of warriors. The metal felt cold and reassuring against his palm, a tangible reminder of his duty to protect Holmvik from all threats. "You look troubled, nephew." Eric approached, his heavy cloak still damp with melting snow. "Troubled doesn't begin to cover it," Hakon replied, watching through the doorway as the wolves rested peacefully in the courtyard. "That man sits among us telling stories of saving animals, while 14 predators wait outside our hall. How are we supposed to just accept this?" Eric studied his nephew's face, seeing the conflict there. Hakon was a good warrior and a better man, but youth often saw the world in sharper contrast than wisdom allowed. "What do you see when you look at those wolves?" Eric asked. "Danger, unpredictability, creatures that could turn on us without warning." Hakon's voice carried the certainty of training and instinct. "I see beasts that don't belong near human habitation, and yet they've harmed no one. They've shown no aggression. They obey a man's commands with perfect discipline." Eric paused thoughtfully. "Perhaps the danger lies not in what they are, but in our assumptions about what they might do." Outside, Bjorn moved among his companions, checking each one with the gentle attention of a shepherd tending his flock. The great wolf Ulf remained close to his side, amber eyes alert but calm. Smaller wolves played quietly in the snow, their behavior more reminiscent of domestic dogs than wild predators. "Playing," Hakon said with disgust, "as if that proves anything. Wild animals can seem tame until the moment they strike." Several younger warriors had gathered nearby, drawn by their leader's obvious concern. They whispered among themselves, hands resting on weapon hilts, eyes never leaving the wolves. "What are your orders?" asked Tormund, a stocky warrior with arms like tree trunks. "Do we prepare defenses? Set watches?" Hakon felt the weight of their trust and expectation. These men looked to him for guidance, for protection of their families and their way of life. The responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. We watch, he decided. We stay alert, and we remember that our first duty is to the people of this village, not to some romantic notion about a legendary warrior and his pets. Inside the hall, Bjorn finished speaking with the village elders and prepared to leave. The conversation had gone better than he had hoped, but he could sense the undercurrents of fear and suspicion that ran beneath the surface courtesy. As he stepped into the courtyard, he immediately noticed the cluster of young warriors watching him. Their posture spoke of barely contained hostility, and he recognized the signs of men preparing for conflict. "Peace, my friends," he said softly to his companions. Several wolves had begun to rise, sensing the tension from the humans. "They are afraid, and fear makes good men do foolish things." Ulf's ears flattened slightly, a low rumble building in his chest. "No," Bjorn said firmly. "They protect their families as we protect ours. There is no dishonor in their wariness." Hakon approached, his steps measured and deliberate. Behind him, the other warriors spread out slightly, not quite surrounding Bjorn, but positioning themselves strategically. "The council may have accepted your story," Hakon said, his voice carefully controlled. "But stories are just words. These creatures are real, and they're in our village." "They are," Bjorn acknowledged. "And they will remain here as long as I do, which may not be much longer. Leaving already?" There was no disguising the relief in Tormund's voice. "That depends on your chieftain's decision about the threat I mentioned." Bjorn's eyes moved from face to face, reading the fear and aggression there. "But I understand your concerns. You see predators where I see family. You see danger where I see protection." "Pretty words," Hakon said sharply. "But what happens when one of those family members decides a village child looks like prey? What happens when their wild instincts override your commands?" The question hung in the cold air like a challenge. Bjorn considered his response carefully, understanding that his next words could determine whether this encounter ended in peace or bloodshed. "Astrid," he called softly. The little girl, who had been watching from her mother's doorway, broke free and ran toward him with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. Her mother started forward in alarm, but Bjorn raised a gentle hand. "May I show these warriors something, little one?" Astrid nodded eagerly. Bjorn knelt down and whispered something in her ear. The child giggled and walked directly to Ulf, the massive wolf who could have swallowed her whole without effort. "Sit," she commanded in her tiny voice. Ulf sat immediately. "Lie down." The great wolf lowered himself to the snow. "Roll over." To the amazement of every watching warrior, the fearsome predator rolled onto his back, exposing his vulnerable belly to a 5-year-old human. Astrid clapped her hands in delight, then skipped back to Bjorn. "He's very good." "Yes, he is," Bjorn agreed, his eyes never leaving Hakon's face. Would a wild predator, driven by killer instincts, submit so completely to a human child's commands? The warriors exchanged uncertain glances. What they had witnessed challenged everything they believed about the nature of wild animals. "Tricks," Hakon said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Trained behaviors don't change what they are underneath." "You're absolutely right," Bjorn agreed, surprising everyone. "Training doesn't change their nature, but understanding their nature allows us to live in harmony with it." He stood and walked closer to the group of warriors, moving slowly and deliberately. A wolf's nature is to protect its pack, to hunt only when necessary, to show loyalty to those who earn it, and to defend territory against genuine threats. How is that different from a warrior's nature? "We're human," Tormund protested. "We have souls, reason, morality." "Do we?" Bjorn gestured toward Ulf, still lying submissively in the snow. That wolf chose to trust a child because he understands love and gentleness. He recognizes no threat in her innocence. What does that suggest about his capacity for judgment and feeling? Sigrid finally reached them, breathing hard from her dash across the courtyard. She scooped up Astrid, holding her close. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "She got away from me." "No harm done," Bjorn assured her. "In fact, she may have helped prevent a great deal of harm." Hakon stared at the wolf, still motionless in the snow. "Why doesn't he get up?" "Because Astrid hasn't told him he can. He's waiting for permission from someone he recognizes as worthy of respect. Bjorn's voice carried quiet amusement. Rather like a good warrior waits for orders from his commander. The comparison struck home. Several of the younger warriors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the parallel. This proves nothing about their behavior when threatened, Hakon insisted, though his tone had lost some of its edge. You're right again. Shall we test that? Bjorn's eyes glinted with something that might have been humor. Draw your weapon, Hakon. See what happens when they perceive a real threat to someone they're sworn to protect. Hakon's hand moved instinctively toward his sword, then stopped. Around the courtyard, every wolf had risen to its feet, their attention focused on him with laser intensity. They made no aggressive moves, issued no growls or threats, but the message was unmistakable. I think, Eric said from the hall doorway, that we've all learned enough for one day. That evening, as snow continued to fall and the village settled into its familiar rhythms, Olaf the Skald sat by his fire, carefully sharpening his bone-carving knife. The ancient tool had belonged to his master, and his master's master before that, passed down through generations of storytellers who understood that memory was too precious to leave to chance. Alone, the knife's blade gleamed in the firelight as Olaf tested its edge against a piece of deer antler. Satisfied, he began the slow, deliberate work of carving new stories into the bone, stories that would preserve the truth of this remarkable day for generations yet unborn. A knock at his door interrupted the careful work. "Come!" he called, not looking up from his carving. Tormund entered, followed by 3 other young warriors. Their faces showed the uncertainty that had plagued them since the afternoon's events. "Olaf," Tormund began hesitantly, "we came seeking wisdom. Wisdom is earned, not given," the old Skald replied, still focused on his carving. "But knowledge can be shared. What knowledge do you seek?" "The truth about Bjorn. The real truth, not just the stories parents tell children." Tormund sat heavily on a wooden stool. Was he truly the warrior the legends claim? Olaf finally looked up, his ancient eyes studying each young face in turn. "Sit, all of you. The fire is warm and the night is long. Truth requires time to tell properly." The warriors arranged themselves around the hearth as Olaf set aside his carving and reached for a cup of warm ale. He drank deeply, gathering his thoughts, then began to speak in the measured cadence of one who had spent a lifetime preserving memory. "I was barely older than you when Bjorn first earned his reputation. The summer raiders from the eastern seas had swept down upon 3 coastal villages, killing the men and taking the women and children as slaves. The knife caught the firelight as Olaf turned it in his weathered hands, using it to emphasize his words. Bjorn was young then, perhaps 22 winters, but already marked by the gods for greatness. The chieftain at that time was Eric's father, Olmund the Wise, and he chose Bjorn to lead the pursuit. "Against how many raiders?" asked Dag, the youngest of the warriors. 43 men with long ships and superior numbers. Bjorn had 26. Olaf's voice carried the weight of witnessed truth. But Bjorn had something they lacked. He understood that fighting is not just about strength and courage, but about knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. The old man paused to sip his ale, letting the suspense build as any skilled storyteller would. He studied their movements for 3 days, learning their patterns, understanding how they thought. He realized they expected pursuit from the sea, so he led his men overland through terrain they believed impassable. "The broken hills," Tormund breathed. "No one crosses the broken hills with a war party. No one except Bjorn the wolf friend," Olaf confirmed. And that was where he first earned that name. On the 2nd day of their crossing, they encountered a wolf pack that had been driven from its hunting grounds by the same raiders who attacked our villages. Olaf's carving knife moved to a fresh section of bone, beginning a new scene. A lesser man would have seen the wolves as another obstacle to overcome. Bjorn saw them as fellow victims of the raiders' cruelty. Instead of driving them off or killing them for food, he shared his men's provisions with the starving pack. He fed wild wolves. Dig's voice held disbelief. He fed desperate creatures who had lost their territory to human violence. And in return, those wolves led his war party through secret paths in the hills, paths that allowed them to approach the raiders' camp from a direction that was supposedly impossible. The warriors leaned forward, caught up in the tale despite their skepticism about its teller's current circumstances. The attack came at dawn on the fourth day. The raiders were still drunk from their victory celebrations, confident in their security. Bjorn's men struck like lightning from the heights above their camp, but they were not alone. Olaf's voice dropped to an intense whisper. The wolves attacked alongside our warriors, driving the raiders into confusion and terror. Men who had shown no mercy to helpless villagers broke and fled before the sight of human and beast fighting as one. Impossible, muttered one of the warriors, but his protest lacked conviction. Is it? Olaf challenged. You saw those same wolves today obeying a child's commands. You saw their intelligence, their capacity for loyalty and trust. Why is it so hard to believe they could choose to fight beside those who showed them kindness? Tormund rubbed his forehead, struggling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural order. What happened to the captives? The stolen villagers? All freed, all returned safely to their families. Olaf's carving knife moved steadily across the bone, capturing the scene in miniature artwork. Not one life lost among them, though some had been prisoners for weeks. And the raiders? Those who survived were given a choice: swear an oath never to raid our shores again, or face the justice of the families they had wronged. Olaf looked up from his work. Bjorn convinced our people to accept their oaths rather than demand blood vengeance, mercy to enemies. Dag shook his head. That seems like weakness, does it? None of those raiders ever broke their word. None ever returned to threaten our coasts. Some eventually came back as traders and allies, bringing prosperity instead of violence. The old Skald met each young man's eyes. Which choice showed greater strength, killing defeated enemies or transforming them into friends? The fire crackled in the silence as the warriors considered this perspective, but he was still a great fighter. Tormund asked, seeking reassurance in familiar concepts. The greatest I ever saw. But his greatest battles were not the ones he won with sword and spear. They were the ones he won with wisdom and compassion. Olaf returned to his carving, adding fine details to the scene taking shape on the bone. There was the Battle of Three Rivers, where he convinced two enemy armies to join forces against a common threat. The Siege of Iron Gate, where he ended a month-long standoff by walking alone into the enemy camp and offering to settle the dispute through single combat with their champion. He won? Obviously, Dag said. He fought the champion to a standstill, then proposed that both armies withdraw and divide the disputed territory equally. Olaf smiled at the memory. The champion became one of his closest friends and fought beside him in later campaigns. The warriors sat in contemplative silence, processing these revelations about a man they had seen only as a potential threat. Why did he really disappear? Tormund asked finally. The truth, not the story he told in the hall. Olaf set down his carving knife and fixed them with a steady gaze. Because a man's greatest enemy is not any opponent he can face with weapons. It is the moment when his own success begins to corrupt his purpose. 3 days after Bjorn's arrival, Hakon could no longer contain his frustration. The village had settled into an uneasy routine with the wolves present, but every instinct the young warrior possessed screamed warnings about the unnaturalness of the situation. Children played too close to predators. Elders spoke fondly of the wolf friend's return, and his own men seemed increasingly uncertain about their duty to protect the community. The final straw came when he found his youngest sister, Ingrid, sitting peacefully beside two of the wolves near the village well, sharing her morning bread with them as if they were stray dogs. Enough, he muttered, storming back to the warrior's hall, where his most trusted companions awaited orders. Tormund looked up from sharpening his axe blade, noting the grim determination on his leader's face. You've decided something. We're going to settle this matter once and for all. Hakon pulled his hunting bow from the wall rack, checking the string tension with practiced movements. These beasts may seem tame now, but we need to know what we're truly dealing with. We need to see them in their natural environment, away from Bjorn's influence. You want to track them? Dag asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. I want to observe them, to understand their true nature. Hakon selected arrows from his quiver, each one tipped with a sharp iron point that had never failed to bring down prey. One arrow bore a distinctive red fletching, the mark he used to track wounded game. If they're truly as docile as Bjorn claims, then we'll have proof. If not, he didn't need to finish the thought. The other warriors understood the implication. Within the hour, 6 armed men slipped quietly from the village and into the forest paths that led toward Bjorn's dwelling. The snow made tracking easy. The distinctive paw prints of the wolf pack were clearly visible, leading deeper into the woods where few villagers dared to venture. The forest felt different as they moved through it. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow, creating a cathedral-like silence broken only by the soft crunch of their footsteps. Hakon had hunted these woods since childhood, but today the familiar paths seemed to whisper warnings. "Look at this," Tormund called softly. Kneeling beside a large oak tree, the warriors gathered around him, studying the peculiar sight. The tree bore claw marks, but not the random scratches of a bear marking territory. These were deliberate patterns carved into the bark, almost like primitive runes or symbols. "What does it mean?" Dag whispered. "Territory markers," Hakon said with more confidence than he felt. "They're claiming this entire forest as their hunting ground." Deeper into the woods, they found more signs of the wolves' presence. Game trails that showed unusual traffic patterns, as if deer and elk moved through the forest differently than before. Fallen logs arranged in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural windfall. Then they heard voices. The warriors crept forward through the undergrowth until they could observe a small clearing ahead. Bjorn's dwelling came into view, a simple wooden structure built against a natural rock formation, with additions that seemed to blend seamlessly into the landscape. But it was the activity in the clearing that made their blood run cold. The wolves moved through the area with obvious intelligence and purpose. Some appeared to be hunting, but not randomly. They worked together in coordinated patterns that spoke of planning and communication. Others tended to what could only be described as gardens, areas where useful plants had been cultivated and protected, and in the center of it all, Bjorn worked alongside them as naturally as a farmer works with his ox. "By the gods," Tormund breathed. "They're not just living together, they're cooperating." Hakon watched in fascination and growing unease as one of the wolves approached Bjorn with something in its mouth, an injured rabbit. Rather than devouring the prey immediately, the wolf presented it to Bjorn, who examined the small creature gently before treating its wounds with herbs and releasing it back into the wild. "Madness," Hakon muttered. "Absolute madness, or something else entirely," came a quiet voice behind them. The warriors spun around, weapons raised, to find themselves surrounded by half the wolf pack. The creatures had approached in complete silence, moving like grey ghosts through the forest. Amber eyes regarded them with unmistakable intelligence and a wariness that stopped just short of hostility. "Peace. My friends!" Bjorn emerged from behind a massive pine, his approach as silent as his companions. "These men mean no immediate harm. They seek understanding, though they pursue it through methods born of fear." Hakon's bow was drawn and aimed before he consciously decided to move, but something in the wolves' posture made him hesitate. They showed no aggression, merely alert attention. Even with an arrow pointed at their guardian, they remained calm. "Lower your weapon, Hakon," Bjorn said gently. "There's no need for violence here. You live with them," Hakon said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "You truly live as one of their pack." "I live as a member of a family that happens to include wolves." "Yes." Bjorn stepped closer, unafraid of the drawn bow. "Is that so different from any man who considers his hunting hounds to be family? Dogs are domesticated. These are wild predators, are they? Look around you, young warrior. Do you see the behavior of wild predators? Or do you see the actions of creatures who have chosen to live by different rules?" Dag pointed with a shaking hand toward the gardens. They farm. The wolves actually help tend plants. They understand that taking care of the forest means the forest takes care of them. Bjorn's voice carried infinite patience. They learned this wisdom naturally. It took me years to understand what they knew instinctively. One of the smaller wolves approached Tormund, who stood frozen with indecision. The creature sat down just outside of arm's reach and tilted its head curiously, studying the armed human with obvious interest rather than fear. "Why aren't they attacking?" Tormund whispered. "Because they don't see enemies," Bjorn replied. "They see confused members of their extended pack, Holmvik's warriors, who belong to the same community they've sworn to protect." The wolf near Tormund whined softly and pawed at the ground, uncovering something buried in the snow. It was a child's wooden toy, a carved horse that belonged to little Astrid, lost during one of her forest adventures weeks ago. The wolf picked up the toy gently in its mouth and offered it to Tormund. Tail wagging slightly, "They've been watching over the village children when they wander too far into the woods," Bjorn explained. "Protecting them, guiding them back to safety. How many wild predators do you know who return lost toys?" Hakon's bow arm began to shake. Everything he thought he understood about the nature of wolves, about the clear divisions between civilization and wilderness, was crumbling before his eyes. "This isn't natural," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Bjorn agreed. "It's something far better than natural. It's chosen." These wolves could live as their ancestors did, taking what they needed through force and cunning. Instead, they choose cooperation, protection, mutual care. The great wolf Ulf emerged from the forest, carrying something in his mouth. He approached Hakon directly and dropped the object at the young warriors. Feet, it was one of Hakon's own arrows, the one with the distinctive red fletching. The arrow lay in the snow between Hakon and the great wolf, its red fletching bright against the white ground. The young warrior stared at it, his mind racing to understand how Ulf had come to possess something he had lost 3 days ago during a hunting expedition. "You dropped it near the eastern ridge," Bjorn said quietly, answering the unspoken question. "Ulf found it and has been waiting for an opportunity to return it. Wolves understand the value of lost things." Hakon slowly lowered his bow, the tension leaving his arms as understanding began to dawn. "He's been following us." "Following me, not stalking. Watching over." Bjorn knelt beside Ulf and ran gentle fingers through the wolf's thick fur. "You are Holmvik's protector, which makes you part of what we guard. Of course he would watch over you." One of the smaller wolves limped slightly as it moved through the clearing, and Dag noticed a makeshift bandage around its front paw. "That one is injured." "Yes, she stepped into a poacher's trap 2 nights ago." Bjorn reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew several dried herbs, their earthy scent filling the cold air. "The healing goes slowly, but it goes." He approached the injured wolf, who settled calmly as he examined the wound. With practiced movements, he unwrapped the old bandage, cleaned the healing cut with melted snow, and applied fresh moss before rebinding it with strips of clean cloth. "May I?" Dag asked, surprising himself with the question. Bjorn looked up in surprise. "You wish to help?" "I've treated hunting injuries before. The principles should be similar." The wolf watched Dag approach with alert but unafraid eyes. When the young warrior knelt beside Bjorn and carefully examined the treated wound, she remained perfectly still, seeming to understand his intent. "The moss," Dag said with wonder. "It's actually speeding the healing." "Where did you learn this?" "From them," Bjorn replied simply. "Wolves know which plants heal and which harm. They taught me their forest medicine, and I combined it with human knowledge of wound care." Tormund still stood frozen, holding Astrid's wooden horse. The wolf, who had given it to him, sat patiently nearby, watching him with expectant eyes. "I think," Bjorn said gently, "she's waiting for you to accept her gift properly." How does one accept a gift from a wolf? The same way one accepts any gift offered in friendship. With gratitude and respect, Tormund knelt slowly and extended his hand toward the wolf. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped forward and allowed him to stroke her head briefly before retreating to a comfortable distance. "Her name is Luna," Bjorn said. She lost her own pup last spring to disease. Since then, she's adopted every village child as her responsibility. The simple statement hit the warriors like a physical blow. These creatures they had feared as mindless predators grieved their losses and formed emotional attachments, just as humans did. Hakon picked up his arrow and studied it carefully. The shaft was undamaged, but tiny tooth marks showed where Ulf had carried it gently without causing harm. "How long have you been watching the village?" he asked. "Since the first night I returned," Bjorn admitted. "Not spying, protecting. There are dangers in these mountains that ordinary patrols might miss. My family has been acting as an extended guard for your family. What kind of dangers?" Before Bjorn could answer, a low growl rumbled through the pack. Every wolf had gone rigid, ears pricked forward, noses testing the wind. Ulf moved to stand between the humans and the southern tree line, his posture shifting from relaxed companionship to alert guardianship. "Something approaches from the south," Bjorn said, his own demeanor changing as he rose to his feet. "Something that doesn't belong in these forests." The warriors instinctively formed a defensive formation, but Bjorn shook his head. "Follow me. Quietly, we'll observe before acting." They moved through the forest like ghosts, the wolves leading the way with soundless grace. The humans struggled to match their stealth, but managed to avoid making any significant noise as they worked their way toward the source of the disturbance. Through the trees ahead, they could see smoke rising from what should have been an empty section of forest. As they drew closer, voices became audible, harsh, unfamiliar accents speaking in low, urgent tones. Bjorn motioned for everyone to stop and pointed ahead. Through gaps in the pine branches, they could see a rough camp where perhaps a dozen men had made themselves comfortable. Their clothes and weapons marked them as raiders, and their casual attitude suggested they felt completely secure in their temporary stronghold. "Scouts," Hakon breathed. Recognizing the tactical situation immediately, "advanced scouts for a larger force," Bjorn confirmed. "They're mapping the approaches to Holmvik, studying patrol patterns, identifying weaknesses." One of the raiders walked to the edge of the camp and relieved himself against a tree, his casual disrespect for the forest evident in his every action. As he turned back toward the camp, the watchers could see his face clearly, scarred, brutal, marked by a lifetime of violence. "Skorri's men," Bjorn said, his voice heavy with old pain. "You know them?" "I know their leader. Skorri the Ruthless. We have unfinished business, he and I." The wolves had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the raiders' camp, maintaining perfect silence while keeping every escape route under observation. Their discipline was remarkable. Predators exercising the patience of seasoned military scouts. "We should return to the village," Dag whispered. "Warn the others." "Yes," Bjorn agreed, "but carefully. If they realize they've been discovered, they may accelerate their plans." The journey back to his dwelling passed in tense silence. Once they were safely away from the raiders, Bjorn began gathering supplies, weapons that had been hidden away for 20 years, armor carefully preserved, tools of war that spoke of a warrior's past. "You're preparing for battle," Hakon observed. "I'm preparing to defend what matters." Bjorn lifted a mail shirt from a wooden chest, its metal link still bright despite years of storage. "Skorri has come for me, but he'll try to use Holmvik as leverage. I won't allow innocent people to suffer for my past choices." "Your past choices?" "Skorri was the raider who killed my family while I was away on campaign. I've carried that debt for 20 years. Bjorn's hand stilled on the armor. "He believes he took everything from me that night. He's about to learn that some losses only make a man more dangerous." Ulf approached and laid his great head against Bjorn's shoulder in a gesture of unmistakable support and loyalty. Around the clearing, the other wolves took up positions that turned the simple dwelling into a fortress. "Will you stand with us?" Bjorn asked the warriors. "Not just with me, but with them. As one pack protecting one territory?" Hakon looked at his men, seeing his own transformation reflected in their faces. They had come here to assess a threat and discovered instead an alliance they had never imagined possible. "We stand with Holmvik," he said finally. "All of it. Human and wolf alike." The war council convened at dawn in the great hall, with Bjorn and Hakon presenting their discovery to Chieftain Eric and the village elders. Maps spread across the wooden tables showed the forest approaches, while weapons were checked and strategies discussed in hushed, urgent tones. 12 scouts, Eric said grimly, studying the rough sketch Hakon had made of the raiders' camp, which suggests a main force of at least 60 men, possibly more. Skorri never travels light, Bjorn confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of old knowledge. He believes overwhelming force is the answer to every problem. Elder Ragnhild leaned forward, her weathered face creased with worry. Can we evacuate the children? Send them to the summer pastures? Not in this snow, and not without alerting the scouts that we know of their presence. Bjorn shook his head. Skorri's men would intercept any large movement. We must assume the village is already surrounded. The morning sun, streaming through the hall's windows, caught something metallic outside, and Eric rose to investigate. What he saw made his blood run cold. A lone rider approached the village gate, moving with the casual confidence of one who feared no opposition. The man was massive, his armor black as night, and from his spear flew a tattered banner that Eric recognized from descriptions in the oldest war stories. Skorri the Ruthless had come to Holmvik. He's here, Eric said quietly, and the entire hall fell silent. Bjorn looked through the window and felt 20 years of carefully controlled anger surge through his chest. Skorri looked older, more scarred, but his presence still radiated the same casual cruelty that had made him legendary for all the wrong reasons. He comes alone? Hakon asked. Skorri always announces himself formally before an attack. It's not honor, it's intimidation. Bjorn's hand moved unconsciously to where his sword would hang. He wants his enemies to know death is coming and have time to fear it. Outside, the wolves had emerged from various shelters around the village. They formed a loose semicircle around Skorri's horse, not approaching, but making their presence unmistakably known. The war leader's mount stamped nervously, sensing predators nearby. Eric gathered his resolve and walked toward the hall entrance. I'll hear what he has to say. No. Bjorn stood, and for the first time since his return, the legendary warrior was fully visible beneath the hermit's disguise. He's come for me. Let me face him. The two men walked together toward the village gate, followed by Hakon and his warriors. Behind them, the entire population of Holmvik emerged from their homes, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Skorri sat his horse with practiced arrogance, his black banner snapping in the cold wind. When he spoke, his voice carried across the village like thunder. I seek Bjorn Eriksson, called the wolf friend. I know he shelters here among you sheep. I am Bjorn, came the calm reply as the former warrior stepped forward. What brings you to Holmvik, Skorri? A smile spread across the raider's scarred face. Not pleasant, but predatory. 20 years, wolf friend. 20 years I've searched for the ghost who cost me the greatest victory of my career. The Battle of Ravensford was hardly a victory for anyone, Bjorn replied evenly. Too many good men died on both sides, including my brother. Skorri's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Magnus the Bold, cut down by your blade in single combat while our armies watched. A ripple of understanding passed through the crowd. This was not just about old raiding disputes. This was blood vengeance. Your brother challenged me to single combat to settle the battle without further bloodshed, Bjorn said carefully. He died honorably, fighting for his beliefs. He died because you cheated. Skorri's accusation rang across the village square. No man could have moved as fast as you did that day, struck with such precision. You had supernatural aid. Bjorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. What are you suggesting? The wolves, wolf friend. Even then, you fought with their unnatural speed and cunning. Magnus never had a fair chance against a man who had sold his soul to beasts. The accusation was absurd, but Bjorn could see its effect on some of the villagers. Superstition ran deep in these mountains, and the idea of a warrior gaining power through dark alliances was not uncommon in the old stories. I fought your brother with sword and skill alone, Bjorn said firmly. Nothing more. Then prove it. Skorri dismounted from his horse and drew his massive two-handed sword. The blade was nearly as tall as a man, its edge gleaming with lethal sharpness. "Face me now without your pack of demons. Let us settle this debt honestly." Eric stepped forward. "This is not your fight alone, Bjorn. Holmvik stands—" "No." Skorri's voice cracked like a whip. "This is between the wolf friend and me. The village need not suffer for his sins if he faces me in single combat here and now. And if he refuses?" Eric asked. Skorri gestured toward the forest, and answering horn calls echoed from multiple directions. "Then my army will take this village apart stone by stone until they find him anyway. Women, children, elderly, all will pay the price for sheltering a oathbreaker." The terrible mathematics of the situation became clear to everyone present. Skorri had positioned his forces to surround the village completely. Any attempt to fight would result in a slaughter of innocents. "You always were a coward who hid behind threats to the helpless," Bjorn said, his voice carrying an edge of the old authority. "And you always were a fool who thought mercy was strength." Skorri raised his sword in formal challenge. "Will you face me, or will you watch these people die for your crimes?" Ulf emerged from the crowd of wolves and positioned himself between Bjorn and Skorri. The great wolf's hackles were raised, his amber eyes fixed on the threat to his pack leader. "Call off your beast," Skorri demanded. "Face me as a man, not as some forest demon." "Ulf protects family," Bjorn said quietly, placing a hand on the wolf's head. "As any creature should. Then you admit it. You draw power from these monsters. I draw strength from loyalty freely given, yes. Just as any leader does from those who choose to follow him." Bjorn's voice grew stronger. "The difference is that my companions serve out of love, not fear." Skorri spat in the snow. "Pretty words from a hermit who abandoned his duties. Where was this loyalty when your own family burned?" The blow struck home. Bjorn's composure cracked slightly, and the pain of that old loss flickered across his features. "Yes, I remember that night," Skorri continued with savage satisfaction. "A small farmstead poorly defended. A woman and 2 children who screamed your name as the flames consumed them. They died calling for their great warrior to save them, never knowing their hero was off playing with wolves instead of protecting his own blood." The crowd gasped. Many had known Bjorn had lost his family, but none had known the circumstances. "You killed them," Bjorn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I killed them to draw you out, to force you to face the consequences of choosing animals over humans." Skorri's smile was triumphant. "And even then you chose the beasts. You vanished into the forest rather than seeking proper vengeance, because vengeance would not have brought them back, but it would have satisfied honor. It would have shown the world that some debts must be paid in blood." Skorri raised his banner higher. "Instead, you became a legend of cowardice, the great warrior who ran away when his failures came home to roost." The black banner snapped in the wind, its fabric stained with years of violence and marked with symbols that spoke of raids across 3 kingdoms. It was more than cloth. It was a testament to a lifetime of cruelty and a promise of more to come. Bjorn looked around at the faces surrounding him, villagers he had known since childhood, warriors who had begun to trust him, children who played fearlessly with his wolves. All of them would suffer for his past choices if he failed to act. "Very well," he said finally. "I accept your challenge, Skorri. Single combat here and now." "Bjorn, no," Eric protested. "We can find another way." "There is no other way." Bjorn's voice carried absolute certainty. "This debt has followed me for 20 years. It's time to settle it one way or another." He began walking toward his dwelling to retrieve his weapons, but Skorri's voice stopped him cold. "One more condition, wolf friend. When I kill you, and I will kill you, your demon pack dies with you. Every last wolf will be hunted down and slaughtered, so no other warrior can be corrupted by their unnatural influence." The threat hung in the air like poison, and Bjorn realized that some choices, once made, echo through generations. The ancient war horn of Holmvik had not sounded in 30 years, not since the great raids that had claimed Eric's father and established the current peace. The massive horn, carved from the tusk of some primordial beast and bound with silver runes, hung in the great hall like a sleeping giant. When Eric lifted it to his lips and blew the long, mournful call to arms, every soul in the village felt the sound in their bones. It was the sound of endings and beginnings, of choices that could not be undone. Bjorn stood in his simple dwelling, surrounded by artifacts of a warrior's life that he had thought never to touch again. His hands moved over familiar weapons with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Each piece told a story. Victories won, comrades lost, moments when steel had decided the fate of nations. The mail shirt slid over his shoulders like the embrace of an old friend. 20 years had not dulled its protection or changed its weight. His sword, when he drew it from its oiled sheath, sang the same note it had sung in 100 battles. The blade bore nicks and scratches that marked specific moments of violence, each one a memory he had tried to forget. "You don't have to do this alone," Hakon said from the doorway. The young warrior had arrived with his companions, all of them armed and ready for battle despite the single combat challenge. "The terms were clear," Bjorn replied, adjusting the straps of his armor. "Single combat. Any interference would give Skorri excuse to unleash his full force on the village. Terms made by a man who murdered your family and threatens innocent children." Hakon stepped closer, his voice urgent. "Honor has its place, but so does practical wisdom." Bjorn lifted his father's shield from its resting place, a battered circular disc of wood and iron that had protected 3 generations of warriors. The painted designs had faded, but the weight remained perfect, balanced for a fighting style that emphasized mobility over brute force. "This shield protected my grandfather when he defended the mountain passes against southern invaders," Bjorn said quietly. "It protected my father when he led the raids that brought prosperity to this valley. It protected me through 20 campaigns across 3 kingdoms." He strapped it to his left arm, feeling the familiar tension of leather and metal. "Today it protects not just me, but everything I have chosen to love more than glory." Through the window, they could see the wolves gathering in the clearing outside. Ulf stood at their center, his magnificent form radiating calm authority. The great wolf's amber eyes met Bjorn's through the glass, and some wordless communication passed between them. "He knows," Dag said softly. "Somehow he understands what's happening. Wolves understand pack loyalty better than most humans do." Bjorn moved to the window and placed his palm against the glass. Outside, Ulf raised his head and howled, a sound of such pure emotion that it raised tears in human eyes. One by one, the other wolves joined the song. Luna, who had adopted every village child as her own. Storm, the dark-furred hunter who could track quarry across bare stone. Silver, whose intelligence exceeded that of many humans. Each voice added to the chorus until the entire forest seemed to ring with their farewell, their saying goodbye. Tormund whispered. "No," Bjorn corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "They're saying they understand, and that they trust me to do what must be done." He turned from the window and faced the 3 warriors. "I need you to promise me something. When this is over, whatever happens, protect them. Don't let Skorri's men hunt them down. They've done nothing but love and serve, and they deserve better than to pay for my choices." "You speak as if you're already dead," Hakon said sharply. "I speak as a man who knows that some battles are won through loss, not victory." Bjorn checked his weapons one final time. "Skorri is younger than I am, stronger, and he fights with the fury of 20 years' worth of hatred. I fight with the weight of 20 years' worth of guilt. Then fight with something else," came a voice from the doorway. They turned to find Olaf the Skald, leaning heavily on his walking staff. The old man moved slowly into the room, his ancient eyes taking in the armor and weapons with approval. "Fight with love," Olaf continued. "Fight with the knowledge that every wolf in that pack chose to stay with you when they could have returned to the wild. Fight with the memory of 6 orphaned pups who grew into magnificent creatures because one man chose compassion over convenience." The Skald reached into his robes and withdrew something small and glinting. and fight with this. It was a silver pendant, no larger than a man's thumb, worked in the shape of a howling wolf. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail of the creature's form captured with loving precision. My wife made this for me 40 years ago, when I was young and foolish enough to think I might become a great warrior myself. Olaf's voice carried the warmth of cherished memory. She said it would remind me that true strength comes not from the lone wolf, but from the pack that chooses to run together. He fastened the pendant around Bjorn's neck, his weathered fingers surprisingly steady. Wear it and remember that you do not fight alone. Every soul in this village, every wolf in your pack, every child who has learned to see wonder instead of fear, they all stand with you. Bjorn touched the pendant, feeling its weight settle against his chest. Thank you, old friend. Thank me by coming home, Olaf replied simply. Outside, the horn sounded again, this time the shorter, sharper blast that summoned all able-bodied defenders to the village center. Eric's voice could be heard calling for order as people gathered despite the danger. The chieftain addresses the people, Hakon observed, preparing them for what might come. Then we should join them. Bjorn pulled on his gauntlets, the leather and mail flexible despite years of storage. A leader's final duty is to his people, not to his own fears. They walked together through the village, past homes where families gathered at windows to watch the procession. Children waved from behind their mothers' skirts, their innocent faces not yet understanding the gravity of the moment. Elderly couples stood hand in hand, remembering other battles, other partings, other times when the horn had called warriors to face impossible odds. In the village center, a circle had been cleared in the snow. Eric stood at its edge, addressing the crowd with the calm authority of a leader who had guided his people through prosperity and hardship alike. We gather today to witness single combat between Bjorn Eriksson and Skorri the Ruthless. Eric announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. The terms have been set, the challenge accepted. Whatever the outcome, Holmvik will remember this day. Skorri waited in the circle's center, his massive sword planted in the snow before him. He had removed his heavy armor, keeping only a mail shirt and his weapons. The message was clear. He was so confident of victory that he would not even take full defensive precautions. "Where are your demon allies, wolf friend?" Skorri called mockingly. "Have they abandoned you already?" In response, the wolf pack emerged from various positions around the village. They formed a larger circle around the combat area, sitting with perfect discipline and watching with intelligent eyes. They made no aggressive moves, but their presence was unmistakable. "They bear witness," Bjorn said simply as he entered the circle. "As is proper for family. Family." Skorri spat the word like a curse. "You choose beasts over blood, monsters over men. When I finish with you, I'll show this village what happens to those who consort with unnatural creatures." Bjorn drew his sword, the steel catching the pale winter sunlight. "You've made many threats, Skorri, but threats are just words until backed by action. Then let's move beyond words." Skorri raised his massive blade, its length nearly equal to Bjorn's height. The weapon was designed for overwhelming power, meant to crush opponents through sheer force and intimidation. Around the circle, wolves and humans watched together as two men prepared to settle a debt 20 years in the making. The pendant around Bjorn's neck caught the light for a moment, reflecting it into Ulf's amber eyes. The great wolf's gaze held steady, patient, trusting. The horn sounded one final time, the single clear note that began formal combat. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sounds were breathing, heartbeats, and the whisper of steel being raised to kill. The first clash of steel rang across the village square like the tolling of a death bell. Skorri's massive sword descended with crushing force, meant to end the fight before it truly began. But the blow struck only snow and earth. Bjorn had moved with the fluid grace that had made him legendary. His father's shield deflecting the strike at precisely the right angle. The battered shield that had protected 3 generations of warriors bore the full impact of Skorri's opening assault. The wood groaned under the stress, iron bands singing with the vibration, but it held firm. The ancient craftsmanship proved its worth once again, turning aside a blow that could have split a lesser defense in half. Still quick. "Wolf-friend," Scorry acknowledged, recovering his stance with practiced ease. "But speed fades with age. Experience compensates," Bjorn replied. Circling to his left and keeping his shield between them, the two warriors began the deadly dance that had decided countless conflicts throughout history. Scorry pressed forward with overwhelming aggression, his great sword carving through the air in massive arcs, designed to break bones even through armor. Each swing carried the force of a falling tree, backed by muscles developed through decades of warfare. Bjorn fought a different kind of battle. Where Scorry used power, he employed precision. Where his opponent relied on intimidation, he trusted in knowledge, hard-won through experience. His sword flickered like silver lightning, probing for openings, testing defenses, forcing Scorry to work harder for each attempted strike. "You fight like an old man," Scorry taunted, stepping forward with a thrust that would have skewered a lesser opponent. "Careful, defensive, afraid to commit. I fight like a man who has nothing left to prove," Bjorn answered, turning the thrust aside and responding with a cut that traced a thin red line across Scorry's forearm. First blood to the wolf-friend. The crowd murmured their approval, but Bjorn took no satisfaction from the minor wound. He knew Scorry too well. The man was testing him, learning his patterns, preparing for the real assault to come. Around the combat circle, the wolves maintained their vigil. Ulf's amber eyes never left Bjorn, following every movement with the intensity of one who understood that more than human lives hung in the balance. The great wolf's ears were pricked forward, his powerful body coiled like a spring, but he remained motionless, despite every instinct that must have screamed for him to join the fight. "Tell me, wolf-friend," Scorry said between sword strokes, "do you dream of them? Your wife and children, burning while you played in the forest with your pets?" The words struck deeper than any blade. For just an instant, Bjorn's concentration wavered, his guard dropping by mere inches. It was enough. Scorry's sword crashed against his shield with redoubled fury, the impact driving him back 3 steps. "There it is." Scorry pressed his advantage, raining blows that forced Bjorn into full defensive posture. "The guilt that has eaten at you for 20 years. The knowledge that you chose animals over your own blood." Each accusation came with another crushing attack. Bjorn's shield arm began to ache under the constant punishment, and his swordwork became increasingly reactive rather than aggressive. The momentum of the battle had shifted decisively. "They died calling your name," Scorry continued relentlessly. "Did you know that?" Your wife screamed for Bjorn the wolf-friend to save them, never knowing their hero was too busy playing nursemaid to wild creatures. Another massive blow nearly tore the shield from Bjorn's arm. The crowd gasped as he stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing on the snow-slicked ground. "And when you finally learned of their deaths, what did you do? Did you seek justice? Did you honor their memory with proper vengeance?" Scorry's blade work became a storm of steel, each strike more vicious than the last. "No, you ran deeper into your forest and pretended the world didn't exist." Bjorn found himself driven back to the very edge of the combat circle. One more step would put him among the spectators, a technical defeat that would forfeit not just his life, but the lives of every wolf in his pack. 20 years of guilt, wolf-friend. 20 years of knowing you failed in the most basic duty of any man, protecting his family. Scorry raised his sword for what looked like a killing blow. Time to join them. But as the blade descended, something unexpected happened. The silver wolf pendant around Bjorn's neck caught the winter sunlight and reflected it directly into Scorry's eyes. The raider blinked instinctively, his perfect strike going slightly wide. It was only a fraction of a second's reprieve, but for a warrior of Bjorn's caliber, it was enough. He twisted aside, letting Scorry's momentum carry him forward, and brought his own sword around in a sweeping cut that opened a gash along his opponent's ribs. The wound was not mortal, but it was significant. More importantly, it reminded both fighters that this battle was far from decided. "Lucky," Scorry grunted, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. "Blessed," Bjorn corrected, touching the pendant briefly. Around the circle, he could see faces in the crowd, not just human faces, but wolf faces as well, all watching with the same expression of hope mixed with fear. By your demon allies, perhaps. But luck runs out, wolf friend. Yes, Bjorn agreed, raising his sword once more. It does. Blood stained the snow in the combat circle, as both warriors circled each other with renewed wariness. Skorri's wound seeped red along his ribs, while Bjorn's shield arm trembled from the punishment it had absorbed. The crowd watched in tense silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be remembered for generations. "You're slowing down," Skorri observed, though his own breathing had grown labored. "Age catches every warrior eventually." "Perhaps," Bjorn replied, but his stance had subtly shifted. Where before he had fought defensively, now he moved with the fluid grace of a predator finding his rhythm. "Or perhaps I was simply remembering how you fight." The next exchange was different. Bjorn pressed the attack with renewed vigor, his swordwork displaying the skill that had made him legendary. He fought not just with technique, but with an understanding of combat that could only be earned through decades of experience. But Skorri was far from finished. The raider leader rallied with the fury that had made him feared across 3 kingdoms. His massive sword became a weapon of pure destruction, carving through the air with lethal intent. The 2 men moved in a deadly dance, neither giving quarter, both seeking the single opening that would end the fight forever. Then disaster struck from an unexpected direction. One of Skorri's hidden archers, positioned in the forest beyond the village, loosed an arrow aimed directly at Bjorn's back. The shaft flew true, meant to end the combat through treachery rather than honest battle. Ulf saw the threat first. The great wolf's amber eyes tracked the arrow's flight, calculating distance and time with predatory precision. Without hesitation, he launched himself forward, crossing 20 feet of snow-covered ground in a single bound. The arrow struck home, but not in Bjorn's back. Instead, it buried itself deep in Ulf's chest as the wolf threw his body between the projectile and his pack leader. The great wolf crashed to the snow, dark blood spreading across his magnificent silver coat. "Ulf!" Bjorn's cry of anguish echoed across the square. He spun toward his fallen companion, momentarily forgetting the battle entirely. "Treachery!" Eric shouted, pointing toward the forest where the archer was already fleeing. "Skorri breaks the terms of single combat." "I break nothing!" Skorri protested, though his eyes showed he had not expected this intervention either. "I cannot control every action of my men." But the damage was done. The sight of the great wolf bleeding in the snow transformed the watching pack from passive observers to active participants. Luna snarled, her grief for the fallen alpha evident in every line of her body. Storm's hackles rose as he prepared to charge the combat circle. The entire pack tensed for violence. "Hold!" Bjorn commanded, though his voice cracked with emotion. "Hold, my friends. This is still my fight." Ulf tried to rise, his strength failing as blood loss took its toll. The arrow had pierced deep, finding vital organs that no amount of forest medicine could heal. But the wolf's amber eyes remained fixed on Bjorn with unwavering loyalty. "You should have let me die clean," Bjorn said to Skorri, his voice carrying a new edge of cold fury. "You should have been content with honest victory. Your demons saved you through witchcraft." Skorri raised his sword again. "It changes nothing. You are still mine to kill." But something fundamental had changed in Bjorn's bearing. The guilt that had weighed him down, the defensive caution that had nearly cost him the fight, all of it burned away in the face of Ulf's sacrifice. The wolf had given his life not out of magic or unnatural compulsion, but out of pure love. "No," Bjorn said quietly, his sword beginning to move with deadly purpose. "I'm not yours to kill. I never was." The final phase of their battle began with an explosion of violence that made their earlier exchanges seem like mere sparring. Bjorn fought with the fury of a man who had finally understood what he was truly fighting for, not just his own life, but the lives of all who had chosen to trust him. His swordwork became poetry written in steel. Every cut flowed into the next with perfect economy of motion. His father's shield deflected attacks with mathematical precision, while his blade found openings that shouldn't have existed. This was Bjorn the wolf friend at his absolute peak, the warrior who had never lost a battle because he understood that true victory came from protecting what mattered most. Skorri fought desperately now, his earlier confidence eroded by the transformation in his opponent. But 20 years of hatred had made him predictable, while 20 years of learning from wolves had taught Bjorn new ways to hunt. The end came swiftly. Bjorn's blade slipped past Skorri's guard like quicksilver, finding the gap between helmet and mail that every warrior knew existed but few could exploit in the heat of battle. Steel parted flesh, and Skorri the Ruthless toppled backward into the snow, his massive sword falling from nerveless fingers. In the sudden silence that followed, only one sound could be heard, the labored breathing of a dying wolf who had given everything to protect his pack. The alpha wolf's silver fang lay in the snow, lost during Ulf's final leap, gleaming like a fallen star. The winter sun hung low over Holmvik as the village gathered for a ceremony unlike any in their long history. Where the combat circle had been, a new monument now stood, a carved stone that would ensure this day's events lived on in memory long after all present had joined their ancestors. Olaf worked carefully with his bone-carving knife, adding the final details to the memorial stone surface. The images told the complete story. Bjorn emerging from the forest with his wolf companions, the great battle with Skorri, and Ulf's sacrifice that had saved them all. But most prominently carved was a scene of wolves and humans standing together, no longer as separate species, but as one united family. Bjorn knelt beside Ulf's still form, his weathered hands gentle on the wolf's magnificent head. The great wolf's breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle, but his amber eyes remained alert and focused on his pack leader's face. "You gave me everything," Bjorn whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Your trust, your loyalty, your very life. I don't deserve such devotion." Ulf's tail moved slightly, barely a twitch, but enough to convey understanding. Around them, the surviving wolves maintained their vigil, forming a protective circle around their dying alpha. Luna pressed close to Ulf's side, offering what comfort she could to her fallen leader. Little Astrid broke free from her mother's grasp and ran to where Bjorn knelt. She placed her small hand on Ulf's head, stroking his fur with the fearless gentleness that only children possess. "Is he going to the place where puppy dogs go when they're tired?" she asked innocently. "Yes, little one," Bjorn replied, managing a sad smile. "He's going to rest with the pack that ran before him. Will he be happy there?" "Very happy. And he'll know that his sacrifice protected everyone he loved." Eric approached slowly, his expression grave. "Skorri's men have withdrawn." When word reached them of their leader's death, they scattered to the winds. "The threat to Holmvik is ended." "The immediate threat," Bjorn corrected. "But there will be others." "There always are. Then you'll help us face them? You'll stay?" Bjorn looked around at the faces surrounding him. Villagers who had learned to see wolves not as enemies, but as guardians. Warriors who had discovered that strength came in many forms. Children who would grow up knowing that the bonds between different species could be stronger than blood. "If you'll have me, if you'll have all of us." Hakon stepped forward, his young face marked by the wisdom that comes from witnessing true heroism. "The village council has already voted. You and your family are welcome in Holmvik, for as long as you choose to stay." "My family," Bjorn repeated softly, watching as Storm and Silver nuzzled their dying alpha with gentle affection. "Yes, I suppose that's exactly what they are." As the afternoon wore on, more villagers came to pay their respects to the wolf who had saved their protector. They brought offerings, pieces of meat, soft furs for bedding, even flowers preserved from the summer months. Each gift was placed near Ulf, with the same reverence they would show for a fallen warrior. Olaf finished his carving as the sun touched the horizon. The memorial stone would stand for centuries, ensuring that future generations understood the true meaning of loyalty and sacrifice. At its base he had inscribed simple words: "Here stands witness to the bond between Bjorn the wolf friend and Ulf the faithful, a testament that love knows no boundaries between species." "It's beautiful," Sigrid said, holding Astrid close as they studied the carved images. "Future generations will know what happened here. They'll know more than that," Olaf replied, setting down his carving knife for the final time. "They'll know that the divisions we create between ourselves and the natural world are often illusions born of fear and misunderstanding." As darkness fell, Ulf drew his last breath surrounded by those he had protected throughout his life. The great wolf passed peacefully, his amber eyes closing as if he were simply settling down for a well-deserved rest. Around him, his pack howled a farewell that echoed through the mountains, a sound of grief, yes, but also of gratitude for a life lived with perfect honor. In the days that followed, life in Holmvik settled into a new rhythm. The surviving wolves integrated seamlessly into village life, serving as guardians and companions, just as Ulf had envisioned. Luna adopted even more village children as her unofficial charges, while Storm and Silver proved invaluable as scouts and protectors of the outlying farms. Bjorn took his place among the village elders, his wisdom and experience helping to guide decisions both large and small. But perhaps more importantly, he began teaching the younger warriors that true strength came not from the ability to defeat enemies, but from the wisdom to turn them into allies. Hakon proved an eager student, learning to see beyond the traditional boundaries of warrior culture. Under Bjorn's guidance, he developed new tactics that incorporated the wolves' natural abilities, creating a defense force unlike any in the northern kingdoms. And in the Great Hall, around the ancient hearthstone that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in Holmvik's history, new stories were told. Tales of the wolf friend's return, of Ulf's heroic sacrifice, and of the day when an entire village learned that the most dangerous divisions are often the ones we create. In our own minds, the memorial stone stood as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most forgotten among us carry the deepest wisdom, and that the loneliest souls often hold the greatest capacity for love. Children would grow up touching its carved surface and learning that honor could be found in the most unexpected places, even in the amber eyes of a wolf who chose to call humans family. As winter gave way to spring, a new life stirred throughout the forest. Bjorn often sat beside the monument, watching Luna's new pups play fearlessly with village children. In those moments, he understood that Ulf's sacrifice had achieved something greater than mere survival. It had created a legacy of trust that would endure for generations. The wolf friend had finally come home,